past board members are just a plethora of opportunity for engagement, for volunteering, for funding, fundraising, and just that wisdom and that experience. Well, oftentimes people join a board, they're, of course, passionate about the topic, passionate about the organization, and they'll continue to stay on the board for 3, 6, 9 years, or maybe even more. And now all of a sudden, after your tenure, after you term out, what is there? Magically on that day, do you lose passion for the organization? Do you not care about the organization? Well, absolutely, of course not. That's somewhat silly. But the fact is, oftentimes in the nonprofit world, once somebody rolls off, we really don't focus on them anymore.